This is the Ag Queen Podcast. This podcast explores the agriculture industry with the movers and shakers of those shaping it. Here's your host, Lori Boyer.
Welcome to the show here today. My guest is Josh Johnston. He is an agronomist with AgriGold, and today we're going to focus on sulfur deficiency.
First of all, sulfur is classified as a micronutrient, but I think we could all make the argument that as time has went on and we've cleaned up the air, we need to maybe put some more emphasis, maybe even call that a macronutrient at this point. I remember my FFA teacher telling us, guys, you'll never need to apply sulfur to any of your farms because we're getting it all through the rain. And back then, that was absolutely true. We were getting, most of the Corn Belt, at least all the eastern side of the Corn Belt, was receiving 25 to 30 pounds of sulfur per year back in those days, which that's a significant amount of sulfur, especially for the amount of nitrogen that we were applying then and the yields that we were anticipating or expecting then. We were getting plenty of sulfur, but through the Clean Air Act and all the things that we've done to try to eliminate pollution, man, they've been working, because the free sulfur that we used to get, we're just not getting that anymore. So it's become a nutrient that we've had to really spend a significant amount of time thinking about and studying and researching. And it turns out that there are some bushels to be gained when we get our sulfur right. So probably starting the conversation, we need to think about what does sulfur do within a plant, corn or soybeans. It's kind of doing the both, and really it's doing a lot of super important things, like being kind of the building block for building these proteins. It's super important when it comes to like building chlorophyll. Sulfur is absolutely required to make that. It's a big component of putting together like amino acids, a lot of different ones. It also is helpful with the plants converting nitrogen within inside themselves back to a usable form, so it can move all throughout the plant. So that's kind of what sulfur does inside the plant. It is a very critical component that we don't run out, that we make sure we have plenty of. The next thing that we should talk about with sulfur is the sulfur cycle. And I like to explain to people pretty much everything that you know about nitrogen and the nitrogen cycle. That's all going to apply to sulfur. It's following the exact same flow. So can sulfur be leached? Well, can nitrogen be leached? Absolutely. So can sulfur. Can sulfur be denitrified? Well, can nitrogen be denitrified? Yep, they both can. So pretty much the exact same cycle, other than the volatility part. Sulfur is not nearly as volatile as, say, something like urea applied to the surface. We really don't have to worry about that, but the other two, we definitely have to worry. It will absolutely leach. It has a negative charge, so does the soil. So it's not binding to anything. It's just free floating in the soil solution. So over time, if we get a tremendous amount of rain, that's going to go deeper and deeper into the soil profile and eventually out of reach. Or if we're in saturated conditions, there's 4 oxygens attached to a sulfate. So the soil biology that needs air to breathe, when we get into those saturated conditions, man, they're stealing the oxygen off the nitrogen. They'll also steal the oxygen off the sulfur. So a lot of the same things apply. So when you're thinking about sulfur, we apply nitrogen every single year because we know it just don't last. We need to apply that same strategy to sulfur. And just like nitrogen, sulfur can be in the organic matter, so you're not starting from ground zero every year. There's a certain amount that's just going to be cycling in your soil. We still do get a bit from rainfall, especially snowfalls, but not enough. I mean, we're going to have to make those applications. So that's the sulfur cycle in a nutshell. So then, now that we've made we've come to the conclusion that we do need to add sulfur, we should probably talk about the most common products. And there's really 2 that really jump really high to the top of that list. One of them being ammonium sulfate, and the other one being ammonium thiosulfate (ATS). AMS would be a dry, it's really heavy fertilizer. It's about like potash when it comes to density. It's got a lot of bulk. It's heavy. It slings good. It spreads good. That's a dry product. The other one, ATS, that's a liquid product that can be mixed with your other liquid fertilizers.
When you said to make sure that you have enough, how do you know how much is enough?
Yes, that's a great question. I don't think anybody actually knows. But when we're trying to come up with this magical enough, okay, probably we need to be thinking about our ratios, since nitrogen and sulfur are kind of very much related. I think about sulfur as a ratio. Here's something really funny. The NCGA growers, the guys that are growing just the highest yields across the countryside, their nitrogen to sulfur ratio are very, very tight. So for every pound of nitrogen that they're putting out, they're adding. I'm sorry, for every 4 to 5 pounds of nitrogen they put out, they're adding a pound of sulfur. Now that's extreme, but they are raising 400 to 600 bushels of corn per year in the contest.
What are some additional recommendations you have when it comes to sulfur use, Josh?
I sort of have two recommendations. One is kind of like everyday farming. We all have, the bulk load of our farms that we would call average. Those type farms, I'm probably going to be in the 10-to-1 ratio. So for every 10 pounds of nitrogen that I apply, I need to make sure that I'm adding 1 pound of sulfur. And then as the souls or the farms increase in productivity, I'm going to gradually stair step down towards, more of the NCGA style recommendations. When I'm working with growers that are competing in the NCGA contest, that's where I'm at. Hey, let's get to 5-to-1. But we're stair stepping, right? Not every acre is going to receive that much sulfur. I'd say for me, the most common recommendation is for every 8 pounds of nitrogen that I apply, I'm going to apply 1 pound of sulfur, and that has gotten me into the sufficient range. It's made the corn a lot greener. It makes the corn a little taller. It just makes overall the health of the corn really, really increase. So that's my recommendations. So back to the products, those two products, AMS, the dry, and the ATS, the liquid, those are the most two common forms of sulfur. So when you think about the country, across the countryside, one of the biggest arguments that people have with using anhydrous ammonia is there's really no way to mix sulfur with that. And that is a really big problem, a real big problem. A lot of the drive to switch to UAN solutions to put nitrogen on your corn is just so you can mix the sulfur in with the nitrogen because they have such a close relationship together. But one of the things that I've found it, and I actually recommend this for every acre of corn that I'm involved in, is incorporating a nice layer of this AMS at the beginning. I do that for a couple of reasons. Number one, typically AMS is your cheapest form of sulfur. This year, the price is overly inflated and it's a little more expensive than it typically would be, and the price difference per unit sulfur on AMS and ATS is really not that different this one year. However, that is a huge anomaly. Usually AMS is significantly cheaper, especially if you count the nitrogen that you're buying in that product as part of your overall nitrogen plan. Then it all of a sudden even becomes more inexpensive for your sulfur. So I always recommend, hey, if you're going to grow corn, you probably need at least 75 pounds of AMS broadcast out there sometime early in the season. I prefer that to go out pre-plant, but a lot of people will do some top dressing with AMS. It's fine. You can do that, no problem. But you will get a little more leaf tissue burn. So if you don't like seeing the discolored leaves, you may transition that to a pre-plant application. The ATS, every time if you're making a liquid application, of UAN, whether that be pre-plant, in with your side dress, whenever you're making those applications, you need to have the sulfur in there. The most common ratio is 28005 would probably be the most common solution that growers mix. So that would be my recommendations as far as applications. There's another really cool thing that we need to talk about when it comes to sulfur, though, and it's unique in this standpoint because you can actually use sulfur as a soil amender, which that's a big word. That's putting a lot of power on sulfur. How can you use that to amend soils? And I view it as like a butter knife. On your clay colloids on your soil, there's about five nutrients that will attach to that. Calcium being one, magnesium, potassium, sodium will actually be stuck on there, and hydrogen. So if you're a base saturation fan, which I am, and you're constantly trying to figure out how to create a balanced soil, sulfur is going to be one of your best friends. The form of sulfur that we use to make those amendments would be elemental sulfur, which that takes a while for that to break down and actually become crop ready, which is why I don't recommend using that ahead of the corn crop. But the other one would be something like gypsum. Let's just set up a couple examples here. Let's just say your magnesium is getting a little too high. I like to hold my magnesium somewhere around 12%. Let's just say you're sneaking up in there in the 14-15% range, and your potassium's coming down. So all those nutrients on your base saturation, when you add those together, they can only add up to be 100. So if you affect one, you're automatically going to be affecting another, right? So when I'm trying to create that balanced soil, I'll use sulfur as that amender. It's a butter knife. It's going through there and it's slicing things off of the clay particles to the soil. So if I'm too high on mag and too low on K, for example, well, I'll add some elemental sulfur to the equation. I'll also add some K to the equation, right? So if I'm knocking mag off, hopefully the K that I'm applying to the soil can reattach, and my K will go up and my magnesium will go down. And it works great as an amender, which that's a big word. That's putting a lot of power on sulfur. How can you use that to amend soils? And I view it as like a butter knife. On your clay colloids on your soil, there's about five nutrients that will attach to that. Calcium being one, magnesium, potassium, sodium will actually be stuck on there, and hydrogen. So if you're a base saturation fan, which I am, and you're constantly trying to figure out how to create a balanced soil, sulfur is going to be one of your best friends. Uh, the form of sulfur that we use to make those amendments would be elemental sulfur, which that takes a while for that to break down and actually become crop ready, which is why I don't recommend using that ahead of the corn crop. But the other one would be something like gypsum. So let's just set up a couple examples here. Let's just say your magnesium is getting a little too high. I like to hold my magnesium somewhere around 12%. Let's just say you're sneaking up in there in the 14-15% range, and your potassium's coming down. So all those nutrients on your base saturation, when you add those together, they can only add up to be 100. So if you affect one, you're automatically going to be affecting another, right? So when I'm trying to create that balanced soil, I'll use sulfur as that amender. It's a butter knife. It's going through there and it's slicing things off of the clay particles to the soil. So if I'm too high on mag and too low on K, for example, well, I'll add some elemental sulfur to the equation. I'll also add some K to the equation, right? So if I'm knocking mag off, hopefully the K that I'm applying to the soil can reattach, and my K will go up and my magnesium will go down. And it works great as an amender. I would say we need to be slightly careful. We can knock too many things off of that clay particle. We can add the wrong things back on. For example, using the gypsum, that's got a ton of calcium in there too. So if you're you could easily knock off way too much mag or way too much hydrogen and add on a whole bunch of calcium. So you just sort of have to think about what your strategy is and pick the product that's going to leave you with the most desirable result.
And how often should you be soil testing then if you're going to use a sulfur application?
Yeah, so if we're tested specifically for sulfur, I don't even recommend looking at the soil sample, right? Because everything we know, we don't really look at nitrogen really on our soil samples. So why, if nitrogen and sulfur are following the same cycle, why would we pay any attention to the number that they give us, right? They're going to give us a number. I don't pay any attention to it. I'm thinking ratios. When I'm growing a crop, I want to be at least 10 to 1 on that ratio. Now, if we're trying to make an amendment to the soil, you better know exactly what your soil sample says before you even think about making that amendment, right? So we could knock off things that we want to hang on to. So you have to be really careful. So to answer your question, if I'm using sulfur as an amender, I want a very recent soil test so I know that I can draw up a program that will output the results that I need. I'm going to follow that year up with another soil test to do a check. Is this working? Am I going down the path that I want to go down? That's the other thing about using soil as an amender or amending soil in general. Don't think don't think about year over year. This is like a 3, 4, 5 year project that you're trying to work on amending and balancing the soil. It's definitely a process.
Is there residual from applying phosphorus? So maybe the next time you don't need quite as much. How does that look?
Yeah, absolutely. I haven't found that yet. I've never got too much phosphorus attached to my soil. It's a process that I'm working towards. Uh, a lot of guys, when you look at your base saturation, they'll say 3 to 5% would be perfect. Most of the soil samples that I'm dealing with are going to be in the 2 to 2.5%, and we're working towards, right. So every year we're making these sulfur applications as an amender. We're adding a bunch of K, and we're trending in the right direction. But over a 4 or 5 year process, I'm just now getting my K levels up to like 3.1%. So it's very, very, very slow.
We are almost out of time here, Josh. Anything else?
Well, just to summarize really quick, sulfur is critically important. We're not getting the sulfur that we used to get out of the atmosphere. Please make a plan to get some sulfur implemented into both your corn and soybean crops because it is an essential nutrient.
Thanks for tuning in to this edition of the Ag Queen Podcast with your host, Lori Boyer.